Hi everyone. So in today's lesson we are looking at what was the Battle of Britain. We've got two learning objectives. We need to try to understand why the Battle of Britain took place and also to look at why the Nazis suffered their first military defeat here at the hands of the British. Now in Google Classrooms you'll have a quiz to complete at the end of this lesson and submit. The deadline for that is Sunday the 5th of July at 5 p.m. If for whatever reason you cannot access the quiz, please contact your teacher and they will give you an alternative task to complete. Any questions or feedback from today's lesson, please contact me, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. Now, our starting task. Let's have a look at this poster. And it says there, never was so much owed by so many to so few. Quote from Winston Churchill. And we can see you've got some pilots underneath that quote in the poster. Now, have a quick think. What do you think the message might be of that poster? And we're going to come back to that at the end of today's lesson. So, we had seen in previous lessons that the Nazis invaded countries quickly, using technology like planes and tanks and motorcycles, etc., to move the troops swiftly into the country they were invading. And this was called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. That was the tactic that was used very successfully. But the Nazis couldn't really use this tactic when they were invading Britain. Have a look at this map. Why do you think that might be the case? Well done if you realise actually the Nazis had only really used this tactic in mainland Europe. You can see that pretty much all of the countries are landlocked next to each other in blue that the Nazis had taken over. But Britain, as an island, was surrounded by water, and so you couldn't really just steamroller in with your troops. Why not? Well, let's imagine if Hitler had put his troops on boats and sent them across the channel towards Britain, then British planes could just have flown over and sunk the boats. And that meant it was clear that Hitler had to use his planes, called the Luftwaffe, to destroy the British planes, the Royal Air Force or the RAF. And then you could send the troops over without worry, because there would be no planes to stop your ships. So Hitler started to plan this. It was called Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. And German troops were assembled along the French coast. They were ready to start to load up boats when the command was given. And Hitler was confident. Of course he was. You've just seen on that map how much of Western Europe he had been able to conquer. Britain was just a tiny little island. And also that confidence was supplied by the person in charge of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering. And he said, I'll be able to conquer Britain in 4 days. And that meant that the British Air Force was all that stood in the way of a Nazi invasion of Britain. And Britain stood alone at this point. There was no other country to support them. The USA were not a part of the war, and Russia, who would come in the war on the side of the British later on, was still fighting with the Germans. Therefore, it was the Luftwaffe, controlled by Hermann Goering, against the RAF Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Which one of these two would come out on top would determine the fate of Britain. So Hitler's plan was simple, that German planes would fly over and they would bomb British airfields and aircraft. And any British aeroplanes in the sky would be shot down as well. He would also target British factories, especially those he felt were producing planes. And this attack started the 10th of July 1940. And this meant that over Britain it could be a common sight during that summer to see planes fighting each other in the sky above you, or what they were known dogfights. And the BBC took part and would film a lot of this as well to show to people. Now the Germans were confident. They felt that their planes were superior. They had more pilots who were better trained. Germany was training 800 new pilots a month, Britain just 200. Furthermore, the Germans had 824 fighter planes and 1,017 bombers, whereas Britain just had 591 fighter planes and a total of 1,400 pilots. So the numbers were in Germany's favour. And Germans also felt that Britain would not be able to keep manufacturing or making planes to replace ones that they destroyed. They felt they could just grind the British down in no time at all. But what really happened was that actually the planes were more evenly matched than the Germans had expected. The British planes, there was no real difference at all. Also, the German planes only had enough fuel to fly over Britain for 30 minutes before they had to fly back around again, whereas the British planes could land, refuel, and then rejoin the battle. And also, German planes were told to fly together in a formation where they were close to each other. And that meant for the British planes, it was quite easy to shoot them down and attack them. But the British could have been in a lot of trouble during the Battle of Britain. Because if you think about it, when the Germans flew over, when they saw a plane, they would be able to attack it very quickly. And by the time a German plane was seen by the British, and they ran to their plane to try to get it in the sky to fight them, well, that would take time, wouldn't it? They don't just go straight away. And by that time, the Germans could have flown over, seen the plane abandoned on the runway, shot it, made it burst into flames, and have flown off before anything could have happened at all. And that was a very real fear at the time. How do you get past that? Well, one option would be you keep the planes in the air the whole time, and that way you're always ready, always prepared. But just think about the amount of fuel that would take, the amount of man hours that would take to pilot these planes. That's not really possible. It's not practical. But Britain were very lucky because they had a radar system. And what that meant was you had radar stations along the coast of England, and they could detect when the German planes were coming towards England. And they could give warnings. The pilots could run to the planes, as we saw there in the previous picture. They could run to their planes, and they could get them up in the sky, ready for takeoff before the Germans arrived. And that meant the British planes were level, like in this picture, ready to attack straight away. So what happened? Well, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, they could use this radar to see the German planes, to know which parts of England they were flying towards. And then they could communicate and direct the pilots and tell them where the fighting was taking place. It meant that the British were fighting far more effectively because of radar, and that they could always be prepared. The Germans could never surprise attack the British here. Britain also kept a secret just how many planes they were losing. It was a far higher number than the newspapers printed to keep morale up at the time. And it also meant that if there were any spies reporting back to the Germans, they actually felt that they were reporting numbers that said that Britain had lost fewer planes than maybe they had done. It kept the British spirit up. It made Hitler's attack seem weaker than maybe they really were. It was kept a secret, the number of planes that were actually shot down. But despite all of these advantages that Britain had, the Germans were slowly winning the war by the end of August. It wasn't the 4 days that Goering had promised, but they were starting to grind down the British. And this was due to a change of tactics by Goering, where he focused exclusively on the airfields. And Britain found it difficult to repair the airfields in time so the planes could take off. And if we look at this fortnight or so, August the 23rd to the 6th of September 1940, we can see the damage that was being caused by the Germans. 103 British pilots killed, 123 others seriously wounded, 6 airfields destroyed and out for days at a time, 500 planes destroyed. Britain needed the airfields to be repaired, and they needed time to make more planes, and it didn't look like they were going to get it. And at this point, 6th of September, the King and Queen visited Dowding, and people commented it was clear just how tired he was at the time. There he is on the right there, sporting that glorious moustache. And he must have feared the worst the next day, 7th of September 1940. Just like the previous days, radar showed a huge German air invasion being launched towards Britain, 400 bombers, 600 fighter planes. And Dowding must have thought the airfields were going to come under more targets now. But it didn't go to the airfields, they weren't the target. And instead, the planes flew over and they flew straight to London, where they commenced hours of bombing. Now, this might sound harsh, but Dowding described this as a miracle. His fighter command, RAF, had almost been eliminated, but the Nazis had changed tactics just when they were on the verge of winning. The airfields were spared at the expense of London. As we can see here, London was bombed instead of the airfields. Now, what happened was Goering and Hitler had changed tactics again. They were impatient that they were not getting the results they had expected. And so they had bombed London instead. They had changed tactics and gone for the cities. And this gave the RAF fighter command time to repair the airfields at the expense of London, which was being heavily bombed. The RAF didn't stop this from happening on the 7th. And that made it seem to the Germans like Britain was close to defeat, because their planes had been able to drop their bombs without any opposition at all. So what happens? A week later, 15th of September 1940, another huge attack was planned by the Germans. And again, radar picked it up that the Luftwaffe were flying over towards Britain, a huge number of them. But here's the difference. The RAF were ready for them this time, because they'd been given time to repair the airfields. They'd been given time to make more planes, and they were ready for a dogfight the Germans simply were not expecting. Now, over 60 German planes were shot down, compared to Britain's 26. It was a huge loss for Germany. But just have a look at this newspaper from the time there. The report is saying 175 Nazi planes shot down. Now, it wasn't that many, so why is it lying? What do you think it would do to public morale? And the answer should be obvious. The figures were exaggerated because it kept British spirits up. The British didn't know how many planes had been shot down. They believed the newspapers, and so it showed a crushing victory for the British against the Germans. Well, it was a good victory, but it maybe wasn't as concise and clear as the newspaper shows. The figures here are exaggerated. And the RAF, however, had won the Battle of Britain. What happens next? Well, Hitler realised that he could no longer attack Britain during the day. The RAF was simply too strong. And so, Operation Sea Lion, all of those Nazi troops on the coast of France just waiting to invade, he said, well, it's being delayed until spring 1941. The reality is that Hitler would never execute Operation Sea Lion at all. This was never going to happen. And the tactics changed again, and now Hitler said we will launch night attacks instead, when the RAF cannot protect the people. And he used terrorism to try to get Britain to surrender. The German bombers flew over at night time and dropped bombs on Britain. And this event was known as the Blitz, and it's what we will look at next week. But let's go back to this poster then to end this lesson then. And let's look. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. And this came from a speech from Churchill, the 20th of August 1940, where he was trying to keep people's spirits up. Churchill recognised, as the nation did, that actually it was only a small number of pilots that were the reason why Britain was not invaded by the Nazis. And you can still see monuments and you can still see recognition of these brave pilots today across Britain for the job that they did in making sure that Britain was never invaded. Now, again, you should have this quiz in Google Classrooms to complete. Please make sure it's submitted by Sunday, the 5th of July, 5 p.m. If you cannot complete the quiz for whatever reason, please contact your teacher and they can sort out with another task. Any questions or feedback you've got, gbrown@stopleyhighschool.co.uk. And as always, it just remains for me to say thank you for completing this lesson. Take care, look after yourself, get some exercise and fresh air, and I will see you next week. Take care, guys. All the best. Bye-bye.